Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you live around the world. Well, straight into it, I've changed things. No surprise there. Now, what I have changed is I have lifted the struts up by X amounts to make them more to be in line with the bottom of the hub, and therefore these lovely purple end plate packer thingies. I've done that for the singular reason of I don't want people standing underneath the dome suggesting correctly that it looks rough, because the ends of the bottoms of the struts are all up and down, which they would be. And they would be because they are in their geometrically correct position, which makes the struts look up and down. So I lifted them up in round increments. So it's 3 or 4 or 5. I didn't want to lift it up to the precise amount because I thought that would be a bit difficult in the real world when I come to do it. So this strut here would lift up 3 millimeters to meet that requirement of being sort of flush. This one, however, had to lift 10 millimeters and this one up 5. So you can see within this little hub area there's quite a bit of variance in that amount of adjustment to the struts. I did that because I was going to accept that now the tops of the struts are at a very different height to where I'd prefer them, i.e. not in plane with the geometry, but that would be compensated for by the battens, because the battens would be made to suit each individual strut, which they would be anyway. So I thought, well, if they were going to be different when the struts were in their correct place, why can't they be different to correct for this now change? And I thought that's a good idea. So I proceeded to do this. This is the whole theme of this video is about process. Anyway, I adjusted the battens accordingly. Very straightforward actually, and I was feeling quite proud of myself and finished it, and then I had a look at them and I thought, and this is indicated by these orange strips. I put center lines along. Imagine that these weren't there, and I put the guidelines along my center lines of my battens, and guess what? They didn't do that. See how they all come to a common point? Well, they didn't. Meaning, somewhere in the process, I'd introduced an error, or a bad, introduced an error, or it was a bad part of the process which created the error. Did I say the same thing 2 different ways? Anyway, I had to have a think about that, and just by accident I created these little offsets. And what I'd done is I said, well, I wanted the battens now to be 20 millimeters thick, and therefore, and I'll reduce, don't worry about it because it's not what I finally did. I was going to make the battens 20 millimeters or 25 millimeters thick, put the dihedral angle in, and adjust the bottoms, to meet the struts. Okay, well, if you do that, apparently, as I found out, because the struts are at a different angle, okay, and the 25 millimeter increase in thickness is added square to the struts, okay, they're not all identical in where they, once you put the dihedral angles on it, they're not going to be in exactly the same position that you would think they would be. Shouldn't all the correct answer is yes. Shouldn't they all be in the same relative position, because that's how I created the struts, lifted the struts. But I lifted the struts by slightly different amounts just to flush them up to have a round number. So where this might lift up 3.175 and this one might lift up 10.005, that variance was baked into the method or the process of making these battens. Now, you don't have to follow that too much to understand. I'm really saying I created a process built upon an error, and the process itself had an error, so those two things combined to make a muck-up of my not inconsiderable effort to alter the battens. So, what am I saying after all that shite? Well, what I'm saying is the one consistent thing I could do is to add, in this case, 20 millimeters to the end of the on top of the honeycomb, which is there. That's the top edge of the honeycomb, and I added 20 millimeters in line with these rays or angles that make up the edges of the geometry. So I added it there consistently, so 20 millimeters on that angle, and that meant that if these are slightly different in height, all of the edges at the point of these little extension pieces, all these lines, are in plane to each other. That's important, at least in the SketchUp side of things. Would it have made a material difference in the real world? Probably not. Almost certainly not. But I have been banging on endlessly talking about how if I am using SketchUp, I need to be able to rely on it to reproduce and add to, alter, what have you, the different components that I'm putting on it or in it, manipulating within it. And without that confidence, I can build in those flaming errors that then bite you and leave you puzzled and wasted your work, basically. So now again, after having put the extension pieces in orange, I lifted my battens up to that particular height, meaning all of, well, these battens here are all at the correct height and in plane for the dihedral angles to mate up to each other. That's a big thing to make sure you've done. And you can't see, that's, have I adjusted these ones as well? Yeah, I think I may have adjusted them already, and hence, well, I have, because as I was adjusting them, I was changing the colour, and all of these are now this lighter green, so I've adjusted all of them. Yay! Most people, and I'm going to suggest that, most people probably won't want to do this. Therefore, the process that I've shown supports your end goals. This is my end goal. And I was considering using the battens anyway because I wanted to keep the struts unadulterated. And if I want to, I can alter to my heart's content the position of the struts, the lengths, etc. in any workshop type effort is much easier if they're on a small piece of timber, a lighter piece of timber, and a more sacrificial type of piece of timber rather than the struts. So I could construct the dome in its entirety and then add the battens onto the dome at a later date. These aren't function critical except for the cladding. Now, and this is another reason for having separate battens. There may be positions where I use a different cladding here to here. And if I want to keep the very top surface of the cladding as closely in line as possible to accommodate flashings, then I may want to have a different thickness at this point for a different cladding type and thickness. So therefore this batten can be altered, added to, rebaited or whatever far easier than would a strut. And that is why I'm liking this approach to building these domes. It's a lot more involved than a dome where you just split the piece of timber at the correct angle to create the dihedral angles and screw them together. No hubs, no farting around with all these little fiddly little bits. But because of the style of dome, I have decided, executive decision, that might not be wise, and it might create a series of issues that I don't want to counter. Now, I've seen how one person has done it, a dome very similar to this, but one where it had 5 corners, and I thought, oh, that's quite easy. And all they did was they just used heavier bolts in this area here. And I thought, oh, that is not a silly way of doing it and gets around my paranoia, but I want this type. And that, once you've gone down the track a little ways, kind of has its own life. So if I were to do this again and money were not the object, I might be looking at the Viking dome type of approach using the star plate type connector, because I still think that's one of the most elegant systems on the market. But because they don't do this type of dome and or I alter the dam design, I can't ask them to create a plate just for this particular style of dome that may never be used again. So I could do it with the local laser cutting companies, but I'd hate to think what they would charge me for at least cutting it, if not bending them to the correct angle. So that's why I went down this road, and why I think once the little fiddly bits have been sorted out, it might be a viable option for other people to at least track for their processes, their project. So anyway, with that, 13.5 minutes later, I've altered it. I can now concentrate on other aspects of the dome and or its creation. But there's one thing, I keep on thinking that I'm making it more and more complicated or involved, but I'm doing so leaving the base, actually I'll just base geometry behind, so I'm not altering as much as would be thought. I'm more adding rather than altering, and that's what this is. This is added to the base honeycomb, and in itself can either be used or discarded depending on what you want to do. If you're putting a tarpaulin type cover over it, you could forego a lot of what I'm doing, because that 10mm lift in one area and 5 and a 3 in another would probably be irrelevant or unnecessary. So everything I've shown up to the stage stays. It doesn't get altered, it just is being added to, like that. Okay, with that, I think it's time to have another cup of tea. Well, surprise, surprise. Okay, I'll see you in the next one now. Bye.